What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Duke Wisdom Podcast. I've taken a little bit longer to put this episode out. One, because life has been busy. I keep saying that. I know I probably sound like a broken record. But two, because, well, a lot happened since that Miami game, and I wanted to take a minute to allow myself to reflect, and I knew there were going to be so many different variables that came into play after the Wake Forest game that I did not want to record immediately following the Wake game, and I wanted to, even though it would have been probably maybe even best to have done that, to have had an episode for Tuesday and kept on schedule, but I kind of wanted to have the full scope of everything that followed the aftermath of the Wake game before I hopped on the mic and made some comments. I think it's important to see everything that laid out and not make, presumptive comments or anything like that. I think I think that it was the right decision given everything that's happened. And I'll get into everything that happened in a second, but what I really want to talk about first is everybody hates Duke. That's the title of this episode that you're listening to right now. You clicked on it. And it feels especially true right now. There's this sort of vitriol that exceeds North Carolina fans right now that are just all in my mentions, a lot of different Duke fans' mentions that are everywhere. And it seems that it's always there. It's always laying dormant, right? But it's being fueled by the fiasco post-Wake Forest game. Which I guess I'll go ahead and just mention. I'll get into this further in the episode, but, Duke loses to Wake Forest, and obviously, if you haven't seen it by now, I guess you're living under a rock probably, but the students are on the court with like .6 still on the clock. They're beginning to rush the floor. They run into Kyle Filipowski. They physically, run into him. He extends his leg while he's walking. They run into that. Obviously, that hurts his knee. He has another student kind of push him in the back. And then the managers have to come into the crowd and get Kyle, pull him out. Stanley Borden and the managers have to carry him out. John Shire's going, shaking Steve Forbes' hand. He's breaking that and, trying to break into the crowd to go get Kyle. And so there's that whole situation that happens. But the aftermath has just been insane. It's just been insane, and the reaction of some non-Duke fans to this has been bewildering, to say the least. Almost inhuman amount of hate, of biased hatred, blinding objective reason, I think, in this situation. And so I'll get into that, certainly. That'll be a huge focal point of this episode. And then we'll talk about, court storming as a whole and also the Wake game itself. I think that's something that's been – the Duke did lose that game. It was a game that I talked about that I expected Duke to lose. And I think it's a shame that it's being glazed over because it was a heck of a win for Wake Forest, who, by the way, followed that game up with the Duke curse, the Duke hangover, ended up losing to Notre Dame and almost shooting themselves in the foot, but probably still in the field regardless of that loss to Notre Dame, as long as they don't shoot themselves in the foot again. But who knows? The committee doesn't really like Wake Forest very much. They've proven that in recent years. But I will say, if I was a reporter at that game, there's zero doubt in my mind that I would have written only about what happened. If I was writing from the Duke perspective, but maybe even from the Wake perspective too, that I would have just talked about what happened post-game, because that was the story of that game. What happened in the game, unfortunately, ended up being an afterthought. Sorry to any Wake Forest fans if you're listening that the results of that game were the afterthought. Get mad about that or not, that's the truth. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the Louisville game as well. Looking forward to Virginia. Looking forward physically to Virginia. In a figurative sense, I'm not looking forward to that game because I'm sure that it will be the most painful game of the season. Virginia plays the most painful brand of basketball ever. I hate it. Anyway, And then I'll at the end, I think I'm going to get into a little bit of there's been a little bit of discussion on Twitter, prompted by myself, about the players leaving, staying, who's doing what. And I'll talk a little bit about that. That's obviously going to be a larger discussion for about a month from now. But right now, I'll talk about it a little bit.
Want to join a community of Duke accounts publishing news, theories, and predictions on Duke athletics? Join the Duke Wisdom Network. Just go to dukewisdom.org/join network today and fill out the form with your name and social media. Or you can DM at Duke_wisdom on Twitter or Instagram. Become a part of the community of Duke fans publishing their takes today. Again, that's dukewisdom.org/join network or DM at Duke_wisdom on Twitter or Instagram.
So let's talk about Everybody Hates Duke. Everybody hates Duke. So I posted something about how Duke, fell in the net after beating Louisville by 25. And I was met with, not just Carolina fans, but like a bunch of Kentucky fans and also a Texas Tech guy in my mentions, like telling me to cry more. It serves you right, Filipowski faking that injury. And I'm like, first of all, I haven't thought about Kentucky this season almost at all. They're like an incredibly middling team this season. And, shout out to Reed Shepherd for hitting the game winner recently. He's a fine player. I do think he's very overrated as an NBA draft prospect. I might eat my words on that, but I think he will be a solid role player. I think taking him in the lottery is a reach, certainly a reach, actually. But that's just my opinion on that. Anyway, but Kentucky fans who I've never interacted with, I seldom say anything about Kentucky, honestly. So that's a bit like, why are you so pressed, man? Laettner's shot happened 32 years ago, and you're still mad, I guess. But Texas Tech, like, what are you doing here, man? Like, what are you mad at Duke about? That one regular season game in 2019 or something? Like, what's pressing your buttons, dude? Why is a guy from an irrelevant fan base like coming in here and talking smack? But why does everybody hates Duke? And I think that it's just been so elevated in the level of hate that has been directed towards Duke and, well, very specifically Kyle Filipowski, but Duke in general in the last week. And it's like, why? Well, I'm going to take my best stab at it. There's nothing that college basketball fans love to do more than hate Duke. They're the Dallas Cowboys of college basketball. Everybody hates them. Everybody hates them. Don't want them to win. But Duke is, I think, objectively one of, if not in certain regards, the most successful college basketball program, certainly the most recognizable brand, and that's why they're the most hated. But then there's also nothing that people love to hate more and vent their own frustrations of life, I suppose, upon successful white Duke players. It's been a trend. I've talked about it. I don't love making it about race. I don't love that, but I can't help but think that I think there is a racial component when it comes to Duke, because Duke for the longest time is viewed as this preppy white team, right? Like that's what the guys in the Fab Five said at Michigan. Duke was preppy; they were white. Even though Duke had Grant Hill, Thomas Hill, that was beside the point. The face of Duke was in the 90s, Christian Laettner, and then also Coach K. And so you have this white face of Duke basketball in Coach K, and the face of Duke in the 90s, and who's pretty much widely considered Duke's greatest player of all time, Christian Laettner, who is pretty much the face of hated white college basketball player. And it all kind of starts there. I mean, maybe it predates that, but I'm not going to get too much into that. But there's Laettner, and then there's like Wojo, and everybody hates Wojo. And it's like, well, why do you hate Wojo? I think you hate Wojo because Duke's good, and I guess he annoys you. But like there's no other reason. He's just a deeply passionate player, And then people hate J.J. Redick so much that like Maryland fans made him change his phone number like a million times. And for what reason besides the fact that the guy was cocky and good? And then people hate Grayson Allen. God, they love to hate Grayson Allen, don't they? And I think it's always funny that Grayson Allen ends up being this guy that NBA fan bases hate him until he plays for them, and then they love him. I mean, if the Bucks fan base can grow to love Grayson Allen, Wisconsin fans are still very much in pain over the 2015 championship game loss. If they can learn to love Grayson Allen, anybody can, really. And that just speaks to who he actually is as a person when you see him as Grayson Allen and not just, trippy Duke player that I hate for a reason, I guess. And then they love to hate Grayson Allen. There's, some hate for Luke Kennard, not really. And now Kyle Filipowski has entered his name. He has etched his name into the lore of hated white Duke basketball players. And he was, I guess, the perfect candidate for the storm of absolute total nonsense that ends up happening after this. I'm going to say it right now that I think this is the only way you can objectively look at what happened with the court storm and Kyle Filipowski. This is the only objective account that you should even be able to see. Maybe there is a caveat. There might be a point that's like Shire could have taken the starters out of the game with the 1 second to go down 4. But I've seen weirder things happen. Duke catches that on a contact play, somehow throws up a 3, gets an and 1, they could tie that game, right? Or they get fouled on that play, better yet, and then they hit some free throws there, but to get a rebound and a tap in, it's not impossible, right? It's not impossible. So I think that what you have to consider is the game's not over till the buzzer sounds, but the fans were on the court before the buzzer sounds. So to be able to say basically that Kyle Filipowski was taking his sweet time, that he needs to be more aware and get off the court. I slowed the video down. From the time the buzzer sounded to the contact made with Kyle Filipowski was roughly about 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Also, a student athlete shouldn't have to be worried about people colliding into him 2 seconds after the buzzer just sounded in a close game. That's kind of ridiculous. Also, it's the fact that the fans were on the floor starting with about 0.6 of a second left on the clock. If you're one of the people who are saying that Kyle Filipowski initiated the contact, that's pretty freaking crazy. How does one initiate contact with dozens of people running straight at him? Dozens, hundreds really. But at the time, I guess, of initial contact, dozens. How does one initiate that contact with basically what is essentially a mob? I don't think you can, actually. I think any contact he made would have been purely in self-defense, but the initial contact was very clearly him walking, his leg extended walking, and a student running into his lower leg, and that is clearly where the knee injury that he talked about was sustained. And then after that happens, he makes contact. A second fan comes over, shoves him in the back. Very clear, deliberate contact made by that student to Kyle. And that is where, Filipowski made the comments about how he felt like it was very deliberate and directed at him. It was intentional. That's where that comes into play, and that's where he's not wrong, because clearly that second fan makes deliberate contact. I don't think the first one meant to run into his leg. It just sort of happened. Now, if you're saying that he tripped the student, that he was like the one making the physical contact and tripping him, I have to say that I think you should probably go to therapy and tell your therapist on the little doll where Grayson Allen hurt you. Because, buddy, I don't know what to tell you. If 8 years later you're still hung up on Duke players tripping people, and every time you see any Duke player's leg come into contact with anybody, automatically you're like, oh, he tripped him! Come on, man. I mean, you're one of those guys that probably circulated the highlight videos of Grayson Allen's dirty plays. Those videos were like 4 minutes long. Grayson Allen had 3 plays that can be construed as dirty in his entire collegiate career. I will not entertain anything further than those 3 plays. He had the trip versus Elon, the trip versus Florida State, and the one against Louisville. And those are the only 3 plays that I will entertain. Any other play was just sensationalized by the media, and there was absolutely zero merit to it. If you were the one saying that Filipowski tripped him, you need to reevaluate your own brain and kind of sort out why you have all this unreasonable bias against Duke that clouds your ability to be objective. And so, first of all, any contact Filipowski made after he was hit in the knee is completely, I think, justified entirely because it's purely out of self-defense. But he really didn't do anything. And then there's the whole people that are like, oh, Duke lied. Duke lied for attention. There was never an injury. Filipowski's a baby. Duke just lied for attention. Well, let me rebut that. First of all, there's the people saying that first it was an ankle injury, then a knee injury, then no injury, because it was made up. I think it's pretty clear to see that if you are in the media and you see how rapidly kind of post-game scenarios come into play and come into picture, that obviously Jon Scheyer wasn't concerned with asking Filipowski, what is the exact injury you have? What is it exactly that is ailing you? We need to pinpoint this down and get tests done. No. He's in the heat of a moment. He's emotional. And then they're ushering him into the press conference where he has to address media. And so Jon Scheyer misspoke and misidentified Filipowski's injury as a sprained ankle. Easy to do. That's probably the most common lower leg injury that you could sustain in an easy way. And that's what he said. But that wasn't the case. It never was the case. That's just a miscommunication and an easy miscommunication to make. Filipowski himself said it was a knee injury. And so what he said goes. It is clear, and it was clear, honestly, I think, from the post-game, press conferences and people asking Filipowski questions in the locker room, that this wasn't like a season-ending injury because he was putting his own weight on it, that kind of thing. It seemed like at worst he would miss a game or two kind of thing, even then. But to imply because the severity of the injury wasn't great, that nothing occurred and there was never pain, comes from someone that just hates Duke, 1. And 2, maybe has never suffered an injury, to be quite honest with you. I played basketball, and I suffered a couple of injuries, but I had some minor injuries that hurt bad. But I was able to play out the rest of that game, or I could play the next day. And those injuries hurt a lot more than when I hyperextended my knee and missed a month of play. And so pain level does not dictate severity of injury. It doesn't take a doctor to tell you that. So there's all of that. And you just can't pin any blame on him or Duke or say they were faking it. You're being crazy. But I will give one counter argument, a little bit of leeway. The argument that this wouldn't have been as big of a deal if it wasn't Duke, I think is just true, honestly. Duke dictates news headlines in a way that other college basketball programs just can't, and quite frankly, that they just don't. And so, yeah, I think because it was Duke and because it was Duke's best player, I think that, yeah, it gained a lot more news headline than it would have otherwise, than it would have if that had happened to Clemson. Or, heck, if that had happened to Jalen Blakes, if it wasn't Filipowski, right? If it had happened to Neil Begovic, would anyone have cared? I don't know. Maybe. But it was like the perfect storm to get this into the news cycle. Here's my take on what should be done about it. I think that I'd be fine if court storming was banned. I wouldn't argue with that take at all. I don't argue with that take. I think a lot of other conferences exact fines onto universities when court storming occurs, and they nip court storming in the bud. But the ACC does not. I would be fine if the ACC put a rule in that banned court storming. I would be totally okay with that. But I don't think it's necessary. I think court storming is this sort of unique and fun thing that college basketball has that the NBA and other forms of basketball just don't have and frankly never could have. Because the atmosphere of college and being a student is such a different and much more unique experience than being an NBA fan. And I don't love the comparisons of, well, the NBA doesn't have court storming. Why do we do it in college? And it's like, well, I think it's pretty clear. Those are professional basketball players. That is a professional setting. And those aren't students. Like, it's just a completely different equation. And then I'm okay with breaking traditions if it errs on the side of caution and safety. So I'm fine if they enacted some sort of rule that says you can't court storm. But I think that might be an overreach. I believe you just have to, security just has to be proactive. It has to be ready. And I think that we could make a rule that's like, I've heard people say 10, 15 seconds. I think that's a little too low of a number, because you could have some security guard counting in his head, counting too fast, lets him go after 5. We still have this same issue. I think 30 seconds. You wait 30 seconds, and it's like the guy there's some guy that can talk to the security guard through an earpiece or something that's counting an official 30 seconds. And after 30 seconds of that buzzer sounding, the opposing team should undoubtedly be off the floor. Probably at that point. Or at the very least, over to the sideline, making their way out. And at that point, I think you can then let the students rush the floor. And if your counter to that proposition is that 30 seconds is too long, if you've lost all excitement after 30 seconds and you no longer want to storm the court, you probably shouldn't have been doing it to begin with. You can wait 30 seconds. Plain and simple. But I guess there's always the point as well that it wasn't just the Filipowski incident. It's that there were Wake Forest students going out of their way to get into Mark Mitchell's face and flip him off and to try to block Jared McCain's route to the locker room. And there's just no place for any of that whatsoever. And there's the argument that if the team isn't fully off the court in 30 seconds, that something like that could still happen. And I think after this, that the next team that were to storm the court against Duke certainly probably would do something very similar to Duke. And so I'm a bit worried, especially for like the NC State game. If State beats Duke, I'm a little bit worried about what could maybe happen in that one. So hopefully it would be better handled. But that's my take on it. That's what I think should be done about it. I don't oppose banning court storming, but I think a 30-second window that you give them, a 30-second grace period where you up security and do not allow them to cross, would be the best course of action to me, to please kind of both sides a little bit there. But there were the takes from Jay Billis, who was like, the best way to end court storming is just let them go on one time and then arrest them all. No, that's kind of nuts. I think that is a vast overstep to this problem, and I don't think that's the solution we need. And I think that overreaction from media members like that reflects poorly on Duke, and I wish that things like that hadn't been said. So now let's leave that in the past. I've now talked about court storming for a very, 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 very long time, a much longer amount of time than I would have wished, because we're already at like 24 minutes for this episode. So I'm going to briefly talk about the games. Let's talk about the Wake game. Duke didn't play a bad game in that one. Let's start at that point. Duke didn't play poorly. Wake Forest played well. They shot 53% from 3 and 60 from the floor in what was the most important game Wake Forest has played in at least like almost 15 years. This game was just a must-win for Wake, and they played out of their minds. And the whistle was on Wake's side. It always is at Wake Forest. There's that, 2008 game where the entire Duke starting 5 fouled out. It's a tough place to get a whistle. It was a must-win for Wake. It was their first sellout in a lot since 2017 when that Luke Kennard game. Everything was stacked against Duke, and yet Duke was still in a position to win the game, right? Like, if Tyrese Proctor doesn't make the decision to kind of just flip the ball to Kyle, who wasn't ready for it at the end, and it's forgetting the fact that they turned the ball over 4 of the last 5 possessions, including 2 from Roach in pivotal moments, but just pin it down to that one possession where they could have shot a game-winning shot, really. If Proctor just didn't give that up to Filipowski there, and even if they miss a shot, I'm a lot happier with the way the game ended. I always thought Duke would lose. I'm not mad that they did lose. I'm mad a little bit about the way that they lost because it was such a preventable play, and they actually had a chance to make a game-winning shot. And I would have been fine even if a contested 3 from Roach, Proctor, or McCain would have been acceptable. I don't think Filipowski needed the ball at the end of the game at all. I think he was probably he and Mark didn't need the ball. I think a guard needed to take that shot for the win. Overall, Roach played a very good game outside of those turnovers at the end. McCain played a good game, and Filipowski played a good game. He didn't shoot it well from 3, but other than that, he played pretty well. There was a lot of foul trouble. Ryan Young fouled out. I talked about that. Tyrese Proctor was good off the bench. Outside of that one turnover at the end, is his only turnover of the game. Overall, Hunter Salas cooked. He's a first-team All-ACC player. He's a tremendous player. I think at times, especially there around halftime, Duke could have done a much better job of defending Salas. He had 29 points. There were some threes that they didn't get out on him for. So there were some things that Duke could have prevented. Duke certainly could have won that game. It's not the end of the world that they didn't. So how do they follow that game up? Obviously, Kyle Filipowski plays against Louisville. The injury's not what it could have been, and that is a great thing for that young man and certainly for the team. But Duke did actually sustain an injury against Wake Forest that was really, really detrimental to their season, I think. Caleb Foster gets a lower leg injury, and he's on a scooter in the Louisville game, doesn't play. Shire saying, we don't know when we're going to get him back. To me, seeing how they're treating this injury, I would be stunned if Caleb Foster played again this season, which I think is extremely unfortunate. And I don't think his impact can be overstated, honestly, because now Duke has what I would describe as an iron 5, kind of like UNC had in 22. That Proctor, McCain, Roach, Mitchell, Filipowski come postseason games, the 5 of them are going to be playing like 35 minutes each, or probably 40 minutes in Proctor and Roach and McCain's cases. I think Filipowski and Mitchell play a little less. You get a little bit of Young minutes, a little bit of Stewart. You probably don't see Blake's. You probably don't really see Power much outside of like games that Duke's up like in the Louisville one. You're mostly just going to see Young and Stewart. And I think, honestly, you're not going to see a whole lot of Stewart. So you're going to see like 6 guys mainly, and mainly just 5, really. And those 5 guys are going to be tested. What happens if one of them gets injured? What happens if one of them gets in foul trouble, especially if it's Filipowski? That can put Duke in a really tough position without Foster to lean on there. He's such a dependable 6th man who really was starting for most of the season. So just like Shire said, his heart breaks for Foster. My heart breaks for Caleb Foster and his family. I hope that we see him again. I don't know if that'll be the case, and that's going to make life really tough. We were getting to a point where I thought Duke was a Final Four contender. Without Foster, I think it's hard to say that they're a Final Four contender. I truly believe that, and that's just a pure depth standpoint that you can't do anything about. The Louisville game, Duke was bad in terms of picking up some turnovers at the beginning of the game. That was not ideal. But outside of the early game turnovers, Louisville's just bad. They shot 17% from 3. They're just not good. 52% from the line. It really didn't matter what Duke did in this one. It went their way. Duke, however, did shoot the ball. Really bad free throws still, man. 56%. Free throws are going to come to bite Duke in the butt later in the season, probably, I will say, in the postseason. But 50% from 3, 17 from Mark Mitchell. Great game for him. 19 points for Jeremy Roach. He ends up with player of the game. Fantastic game from him. God, that dude could average 20 points per game if he really wanted to and he took the shot volume. I've always said if he took the same shot volume as R.J. Davis, he'd probably average something similar to R.J. Davis. But Roach is just such a more reserved player. And I think going into March now, if Duke wants any prayer of winning the ACC tournament, of going to the Final Four, they need Jeremy Roach to play like he is the best guard in the country. Because I think at times he can be that. And he needs to shoot a lot for Duke to make runs, because he's so incredibly efficient and poised in most situations. And he's just got that dog. He's Mr. March, and Duke will go as far as he takes them. But they also need Kyle Filipowski to show up. He had an all right game against Louisville. He got in foul trouble, so he ended up with 9 points, 10 rebounds, 6 assists. Solid overall game. Not a great scoring game for Filipowski. But I do think that Flip's going to be necessary in any sort of tournament run as well. McCain had a good game. He had 14 points. He's been solid. Proctor, 8.7 assists was decent. We saw a huge game from Sean Stewart, and I hope that he can replicate some of the success. I don't know how much of it is replicatable. Anyway, because it's Louisville. Take anything against Louisville with a grain of salt. But 9 points, 9 rebounds is, I think, his second best game of the season, and his best game in conference play by far. He's 3 of 3 from the floor, 3 of 4 from the line, which is pretty solid. TJ Power came in. He was just 1 of 4 from 3, 1 of 5 from the floor. There were some moments where he looked like he really wants this, and there was that clip of like Carroll on the bench, and he really wants it for TJ too. That guy's been working so hard. And there were times where he made this play that was like a high effort play that I loved, but he hesitated to make the play, and because he hesitated, he ended up getting a foul. Refs see hesitation. Well, hesitation, one, can cause your opponent to get a one-up on you, a leg over you. But also hesitation, the refs see that, and they're often to call in favor of the guy who didn't hesitate. Confidence is rewarded in basketball. I love TJ Power, and I hope that he's able to get more footing next season. And then there's the main thing that happened is Spencer Hubbard turned on his Tyus Jones, and he went absolutely bonkers. Top of the key 3, just drilled it for his first field goal as a player. So a beautiful triple from the top of the key from Spencer Hubbard. Imagine if that dude was 6'3". Dude would be absolutely monstrous, just all-American status player. He's a skilled dude, man. He really is. So shout out to Spencer Hubbard. Big time play from him. Duke gets a 25-point win against Louisville, and they drop 2 spots in net. And Joe Lunardi, who I don't know why I'm giving him the time of day, because he's horrible at his job, but he takes Duke from the 10th overall team in his bracket and a 3 seed to 13th and a 4 seed for winning by 25 points. You really can't make that up. And that assertion is what made the opposing fan bases that I talked about at the top of the episode, that's what made them mad. Like, wow. The hate for Duke, man, it's in full force right now. No doubt about it. Duke got a big win against Louisville. We're in for a 2 hours of misery against Virginia, win or lose. Much more miserable if there's a loss. I'd prefer to just watch the last 2 minutes of the game, if I'm being honest. Virginia is such a pest defensively. I think Tony Bennett should be in the ACC Coach of the Year race, simply because I think this is the worst offensive basketball team I've ever witnessed in my entire life. And the fact that they're even in the projected NCAA tournament field is a testament to Tony Bennett and the system he has built defensively to just make everybody else so miserable that it gives Virginia a chance to win games. Shout out to them for that. But so hopefully Duke can get a win there. And then they're heading into a tough last week with games at State and a game against UNC, which are made even tougher by the fact that everybody hates Duke now even more, and also the fact that Caleb Foster's out. So that's going to be tough. And I talked about it, and I'm not a liar, so I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about players staying and leaving, who's leaving, who's coming back, that kind of thing. I've talked about this before. I'm a believer that Reeves and Shute are probably transferring simply because they kind of have to, and players coming in, this and that. Kaman Malawach is making his decision in March, most likely. I think if he commits to Duke, that pretty much guarantees Reeves will most likely transfer. And then for me, it's like Foster's coming back. I think McCain's going pro, same as Filipowski. Their stock's too high. McCain is ready to play in the NBA, whether you guys want to face that or not. His biggest issue is sometimes he gets too dribble happy and he puts the ball on the floor, tries to drive too much. I think in the NBA it's a little unfortunate, but they'll kind of square peg him into they'll be like, this dude just needs to shoot threes. That's what he does, and that's what he'll do in the NBA, and he's ready to do that. He's physically ready. So he and Philip will go to the NBA. They'll have like a couple transfers and off the bench probably. I'm most interested to see about TJ Power transfer-wise. I hope that he does not. I think he's incredibly valuable for next year's team, but he's a player that I wouldn't be surprised if he transferred. He's not a guy that I have on my list as I think he's going to, but he's a guy that wouldn't surprise me if he does. He doesn't have to, though. I'll put it that way. I think the biggest question mark is like who you getting back between Proctor and Roach. I think I've talked about this. I err on the side that I think it's Proctor at the moment, but if he plays well enough to get back into the first round of the mock, I think it's Roach. I think they'll get one of them back, and then whoever it is will pair with Caleb Foster in the backcourt next season. And then I want to address, mostly the reason I included time for this is I want to address some nonsense claims about Mark Mitchell. People saying that Mark Mitchell is going to transfer. Could Mark Mitchell go, could he enter his name in the draft? Yeah, maybe. But I think if he enters his name in the draft, I think he will enter his name in the draft, actually. I think he will. But I think a similar thing that happened with Roach is going to happen, that he's going to learn that, well, I'm not guaranteed to get drafted here at all. But he is, however, guaranteed to start for the third consecutive season for Duke and be even better than he is this season. Look, the draft's not going anywhere for Mitchell. His stock's only going to go up as the team could get better next year and as he gets better next season. There's no reason for him to transfer. Shire has so much faith in that guy, and he plays so many minutes already as an underclassman and just has so much faith put in him. That faith is not going to be lost. He's not going to lose any minutes. If Mitchell comes back, he ain't coming off the bench. He comes back, that will be at the expense of incoming freshmen's minutes, right? And he's going to come back, I think. So let's just get over the whole he's transferring thing. I can see a world in which he stays in the draft. I get if that's possible, but transferring, no way, dude. No way. I'll eat a shoe if that happens. That's not happening. So there's my take on that. Virginia coming up on Saturday. From court stormings to Twitter beef, everybody hates Duke. But the people listening to this podcast most likely don't. And I thank you so much, as always, for listening. Make sure to follow and subscribe to the pod and follow Duke Wisdom on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks so much, guys.